In public session, I'd like to welcome our members and also viewers who may be watching our proceedings on Oireachtas TV to the 14th public session of the Joint Oireachtas Committee on Climate Action. So before I introduce our witnesses today, at the request of the Broadcasting Services Unit, I'd ask people to put their phones onto flight mode or to switch them off as they interfere with the broadcasting system. I'd like to extend, on behalf of the committee, a very warm welcome to Mr David Joyce, International Development Officer for the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, MacDara Doyle of the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, Tom Healy, Director of the Neville Economic Research Institute, Willie Noon of SIPTU and Congress Energy and Natural Resources Committee, Yvonne O'Callaghan of SIPTU and Jim Dulligan of Unite and Chair of Congress Energy and Natural Resources Committee. So before we commence the formal proceedings, I just want to begin with some formalities and advise our witnesses on the matter of privilege. So I wish to advise the witnesses that by virtue of Section 17(2)(1) of the Defamation Act 2009, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. If you're directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you're entitled thereafter only to a qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You're directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you're asked to respect the parliamentary practice to the effect that where possible you should not criticise or make charges against any person, persons or entity by name or in such a way as to make him, her or it identifiable. Finally, members are reminded of the long-standing ruling of the Chair to the effect that members should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside the House or an official by name or in such a way as to make him or her identifiable. So I'll now call on Mr Joyce to make your opening statement. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Chair. And on behalf of Congress and our Energy and Natural Resources Sector Group, I'd like to thank the committee for the opportunity to appear before you here today. The unions that comprise our Energy and Natural Resources Sector Group represent tens of thousands of workers in the energy production and distribution sector, all of whom, of course, are directly affected by climate change. I understand that you've been tasked with considering the recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly on this issue and to consider how we can make Ireland a leader in climate action. Your deliberations also, of course, take place in the context of the development of the Integrated Energy and Climate Action Plan for consideration by the European Commission, a process into which your final report will also feed. Our delegation would like to focus in particular on Recommendation 7 from the Citizens' Assembly report, namely the state should end all subsidies for peat extraction and instead spend that money on peat bog restoration and making proper provision for the protection of the rights of the workers impacted, with the majority, 61% of the members of the Assembly, recommending that the state should end all subsidies on a phased basis over 5 years. Clearly, workers in this sector and in other carbon-heavy sectors will face significant challenges in the coming years. Congress made a submission to the Citizens' Assembly which acknowledged this fact and also made the case for a just transition to a low-carbon economy. And unions have been campaigning in this area for a number of years now under the campaign slogan of "There are no jobs on a dead planet." The concept of a just transition originates in the international labour movement and over time has become the benchmark in terms of how we should respond globally and nationally to this challenge. In essence, it means that workers and their communities must not shoulder the burden. The International Labour Organization recommends that transition policies must therefore pay special attention to the industries, regions, communities and workers whose livelihoods might experience the hardest impacts of the transition. In practical terms, that requires governments to formulate accompanying policies through social protection, including unemployment insurance and benefits, skills training and upgrading, workforce redeployment and other appropriate measures. Critically, repeated studies of this process and examples of best practice from Spain, Germany and Australia demonstrate the necessity to ensure the process is based on social dialogue with close coordination between the government, state agencies, employers and trade unions. For example, Spanish unions only last month agreed an historic just transition deal with government and employers with respect to the country's coal mining industry. The deal will see €250 million invested in the mining communities and in supports for the affected workers. It's been hailed by the European Trade Union Confederation as a model for just transition, and they noted that we don't need to choose between a job and protecting the environment. It's possible to have both. In the Australian town of Port Augusta, unions worked with local businesses and citizens to develop their own just transition plan in advance of the 2016 closure of the town's coal-fired power station. Their research found that a solar thermal plant was the best option to enable a smooth skill transfer and to ensure a long-term clean energy solution. The new solar plant will create 1,800 jobs and save 5 million tonnes of greenhouse gas emissions, but it will also, of course, help the wider community to reap the benefits of a zero-carbon future. In addition, Australian unions facing the closure of all coal-fired power stations in the near future recently published a study that highlighted the example of the Ruhr in Germany, a region long synonymous with fossil-based enterprises and now home to a new green industry. The secret was planning, social dialogue and coordination with all of those affected. The study contrasted the success of the Ruhr with the disaster that has befallen the people and communities of Appalachia, where no just transition measures were put in place to deal with the closure of mines in that region. The issue, of course, has been brought to the fore here with the recent announcement by Bord na Móna of a plan that will see the loss of 150 jobs before Easter 2019 and up to 850 redundancies in the peat harvesting business by 2025. It's, of course, a devastating blow for the Midlands and illustrates the immediacy of the challenges posed by climate change to the workers, their families and the wider communities. Congress responded by calling for the establishment of a Just Transition Forum that also initiated, and we've also initiated work with the Neville Institute and unions in the energy and natural resources sector to develop concrete propositions on how we might achieve a just transition for the region and to identify the supports that will be required to do so, along with the many opportunities that this will present. As the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change notes, the transition to a low-carbon, environmentally and socially sustainable economies can become a strong driver of job creation, job upgrading, social justice and poverty eradication. This call was echoed by former President Mary Robbins in a recent keynote address to a climate action conference here in Dublin, where she stressed the importance of just transition and the need to ensure that the rights of communities in the Midlands are protected in this process. That's why Congress has also recently written to Minister Bruton seeking his support for the Silesia Just Transition Declaration at the COP24 meeting in Poland this week, and to return with a commitment to develop and implement such a transition here at home. It's our hope that the Integrated Energy and Climate Action Plan will include concrete proposals on establishing a Just Transition Forum for the Midlands and the wider economy. There are no shortage of guidelines, examples of best practice in this area, including those cited here and those agreed by the world's governments, employers and unions at the ILO. Our Just Transition represents our best chance in terms of tackling climate change in a manner that ensures nobody, including workers and communities in the Midlands, are left behind. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Before we go to the members, I just have one question here in relation to ICTU. Have you carried out any review of the skill base of the current workforce, and has it looked at how many skilled workers have extensive knowledge of peatlands, for example, through re-wetting bogs and maintaining wetlands, or also in tree planting or afforestation? It's just that when you look at 2030, the types of jobs that are going to be out there, Accenture say that 85% of the jobs have not been, I suppose, invented or created yet. And what have you been doing in relation to the reviews, in relation to moving towards that transition to a low-carbon economy through the skill set of the workforce, the existing workforce?
Okay. I'll look to colleagues. I mean, we are looking into the whole area of what's the makeup of the current workforce is. I don't have a hard set of figures to give you today, but I know Jim is very familiar with what's happening in the ESB, and Willie in Bord na Móna, so they might like to come in.
Would you like to come in, Jim, on that, or?
No.
Or Willie? That comes on itself. The microphone works.
No, all I can say at this stage is that in the initial engagement with Bord na Móna, we've clearly laid out that there has to be a skill audit done within the workforce, within Bord na Móna, and try and match that skill set that currently exists with the skill set that will be required in 5 to 6 years' time or over the next decade. We are trying to source resources for the training. We're hoping to get that from the Globalisation Fund, and also we want Bord na Móna to get the stakeholder to ensure that the resources are put in for the retraining commitment. However, the skill set that's currently there for the people on the bogs, that skill set will not be required into the future. It's as simple as that. There may be some portions of it required, but the majority of the skill sets won't be required into the future if they're not cut and peat.
And I suppose the question is, why wasn't the review done of the skill set in advance, knowing that this is coming down the tracks? Why wasn't there a review done of the current workforce?
Well, I think that question shouldn't be aimed at us. I think that question should be aimed at the stakeholder and at the employer, because our understanding was that Bord na Móna was going to stay in peat production up until 2030, but the policy of government has brought that forward
to 2028, yeah.
And even sooner in a lot of cases.
Yeah. Does anyone else want to come in on that? Jim?
Comment in relation to ESB, you're talking about the peat station and generation plants. And obviously the proposal there is about moving to biomass, which is a similar skill set. But I suppose the question is it going to be biomass or not? I suppose that's the question.
Okay, I will move then to our first questioner. It is Senator Devine. You have 10 minutes, and I'll maybe indicate after 3 minutes just to let you know you're going. Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you for your presentations. It's great to see the trade unions involved, because it's the workers that we have to convince to make the change. And I'm just wondering how difficult that was in the case of, obviously, Bord na Móna. It was an iconic part of our history going back so long, and how difficult that was to engage workers to say, listen lads, things have to change, we have to progress here. Just maybe a small bit of background of that, and how you engaged workers to get to the table and to make an agreement on shutting down the first of the plant anyhow, and what negotiations are ongoing to retrain or whatever. It is about, we talked about Rust Belt, so it's about the Midlands. It's about not providing desolation in towns and communities, in families, and depleting them of that population when such a significant industry is gone or is on its way out. So the idea of getting public support for what will take place instead of what we have at the moment. I just wanted to also ask, the workforce itself, this sector is one of the sectors you represent. How many men, how many women are in there? I would imagine there's more men working in it, so obviously the redundancies or the whatever package will be offered will be weighted towards, obviously, the men in the company, and what that does in a socio-economic, psychological sense to smaller communities that abound around them. When you're looking at an alternative to the site, to what will become free, the peatlands, and the reclaiming of it to a certain extent, of the wet agriculture for forestry, for, I know Russia is a big example that I've been looking at, and they have extensive peatlands and they've reclaimed them. I know it doesn't sound an absolute, kind of to compare and contrast with ourselves, but it's one of the ones that has done it successfully, it would seem. So the building of common rate for construction material, paper, solid fuel, fish farming, water buffaloes for cheese. Now I can't imagine we will have that, but they've used quite imaginative use of it while reclaiming it as well, and obviously reinvesting some of the workers into it. Sorry, on the workers as well, I just wanted to know the age profile, if you have an age profile of workers that will be directly affected by it. So it's also about, I suppose in Russia there are the benefits have been to health as well, in that the peat smog has, obviously cleared up, and 20 million people who were living in proximity. It's a large, obviously a massive, large country, but they're no longer exposed to this. So therefore, the respiratory diseases, the asthma, the increase that we're seeing in respiratory diseases and air pollutions is much decreased. We have 17 million per year, dying of respiratory diseases according to WHO, only by air pollution. So that's a significant for that area as well, and it obviously impacts on cardiovascular problems also. In the reconfiguration, and this is the first opportunity that this country, Bord na Móna, has afforded an opportunity for us to implement the just transition, and that could be the template, the rollout to the rest of the thousands and thousands of workers who work in a carbon-heavy industry. So we need to try and get this as right as possible to bring in public opinion and to bring in support for it in a move to sustainable environments that we have. So it affects everything else, and obviously transport is a big thing, but the amount of people using transport to get to work, just to get to work, has increased massively, and it's having a major impact. And we can talk about electric cars, but people are still going to be reliant on getting their own transport to work. Is there a way that in this just transition to protect the environment, to protect villages, to protect small towns, villages within cities even, that we could have local hubs where people can go to work, or more people are going to be working from home, and that will decrease obviously carbon emissions as well? Is that being taken into consideration? Are we all still going to think future-wise that we're still going to have to travel miles to get to where we need to be to get to work? So to consider that as well. What other sectors are there that are carbon heavy that you feel will be impacted upon next? What's the after obviously the Bord na Móna workers? What's the next industry that will have impact, and I suppose in a chronological order of how large they are or how impactful they are on admissions. So I'll just leave it there for now. If you could answer those, I'd be very grateful.
Thank you, Senator. You can answer them in any order you wish. Who would like to?
I think obviously some of them are directed in Bord na Móna, and then Tom might come in as well.
I'll answer the ones I can. That's specific, if you like, to Bord na Móna. In relation to the context of the workforce and how they've taken to what's occurring at the moment, the reaction has been fairly pragmatic. The people in Bord na Móna knew this was coming. They knew that there was a plan to get out of peat over the next decade, and they have resigned themselves to that fact. The problem has been, though, that has now been fast-tracked. People thought that under a decade in peat. It has been fast-tracked, and that has put people under an awful lot of pressure. The second issue then regarding the age profile, the median age is 56 on the bogs. That's the median age. So it is pretty high. However, there is jobs, a lot of jobs earmarked to be got rid of, for want of a better word, in Newbridge. And the majority of those jobs are not bog-related jobs. They could be off the females. There are a lot of females in office jobs. And I think that's been lost on the public, that a lot of these jobs are going to be going, and not just on the bogs themselves. In relation to the sites and reclaiming and using them for forestry, the problem is that trees don't grow in bogs. Some trees do. The majority of them that's of any value don't. So that's just a red herring. In relation to the way the people have been treated in Bord na Móna, they've been treated abysmally. And I think the people should know this. There's been some politicians coming out in the media announcing that they were doing a great service to the members in Bord na Móna by saying, we've got the stakeholder to give out a voluntary severance package. What they didn't say was that the voluntary severance package doesn't give them 1% more to a lot of these people than they would get if they're working in a non-unionised employment. In actual fact, people over 62 are just getting statutory redundancy. In actual fact, there's people on board Mona with this new voluntary severance package who are going to be told they're in a location with no job. You can only get half of what you would earn in the package, but there's no job for you. And they're not getting 1 red cent extra from this new redundancy package. In actual fact, they're worse off. But the politicians who raised to the media didn't tell them they're going to be worse off. Because what they've actually done in this package is they've denied these people their pension entitlements. Their current pension at the moment states quite clearly, if you retire before 60 years of age, you can draw your pension if you go voluntary. There will be an actuarial reduction. And we know there's going to be an actuarial reduction, but they've actually taken that away. No later than an hour ago, I got confirmation from the company before I came in here to say, is that actually true? That it's going to be worse than they ever had before. And the answer I got was yes. And I think that's scandalous. And I think it's scandalous for people to come out, particularly from the government parties, saying that we're doing a great service to these board and wonder people. TDs from the West, from the Midlands, have come out and said this in their own constituency. But they haven't actually said they're going to be worse off. It's actually, it's abysmal. But anyway, that being said, the reality of it is that jobs in the Midlands is going to be very, very hard to get, because Bord na Móna has a big acreage of a land bank, but they are going to be confined to what they can do in that. As I said, trees don't grow in bogs. There is a lot of opposition to, say, wind farms. People are objected to it. There's a lot of NIMBYism going on in relation to the likes of wind farms, etc. And the company have come forward with some good ideas regarding alternative employment. The reality, though, is that a lot of those projects is going to take a period of time to actually get up and running. They're start-up businesses, etc. And the current staff on board Mona, with their age profile, the vast majority of them won't be able to redeploy to new jobs. We are very anxious that whatever would come up regarding new employment ideas would be specifically targeted to the Midlands. Because at this moment in time, it's the people in the Midlands are going to suffer, the towns and villages in the Midlands. I'm from the Midlands myself, so I know all about it. They're really going to suffer because of this. And the last thing I'd say then is that the next industry that's going to be affected and concerned about it, because I have members there as well, as has Jim Dullahan, will be the ESB and the likes of the coal being burned in the ESB stations. That's possibly next in line to be caught under this decarbonisation. So,
Mr. Healy, do you want to come in next? Did you want to come in?
Yes, the pain involved in the just transition, which is clearly manifest in communities in the Midlands that are affected by these job losses, and it's a daunting prospect for people to face Christmas not knowing, or knowing in fact that there is no job there towards the latter end of next year, and there are many thousands of jobs beyond that at risk, not just in the sectors that we're specifically talking about this evening, but in other areas, for example, that are connected to agri-food, that would be in sectors where agriculture, we know, is making a significant contribution to emissions. So I think that there are 2 points here. One is to deal with the crisis, and it is a jobs crisis. It has an effect on the communities involved, to have a plan to deal with that crisis at a local level with innovative and imaginative alternatives in terms of investment and employment, and I can develop some of those points if you wish later. But I think there's a long-term issue where we need to look at the bigger picture, and as a country we have a very high rate of emissions, of greenhouse gas emissions. That's related to a number of things, one of which is the agriculture sector. It's not just agriculture per se, but the way we do agriculture. The second important element to bear in mind is spatial planning, and the extent to which, the way in which we do construction, the planning in the cities and in the towns and in the countryside. To give an example, there's limited value in just increasing the cost of diesel or home heating if at the same time we don't invest heavily in retrofitting and also in an efficient public transport system. It's not just about getting people in and out of Dublin from the Midlands or elsewhere. It's about connecting places like Mullingar, Athlone, Tullamore, Newbridge, where people don't necessarily have to use cars to get to work or to get from one place to another. And that, I think, is a very important point in relation to transport, that the National Development Plan is heavily reliant on motorway construction. The underlying assumption is that private car ownership will continue to expand, albeit with the transition to electric vehicles. I think that's not sustainable. I think we need to think much more in terms of an efficient and green public transport system fit for the 21st century. So this is the bigger picture. It's a difficult and painful transition. When we use the term just transition, we also mean painful transition, and it has distributional implications and it has regional implications, where some regions are disproportionately affected in the short term. And this calls for very difficult decisions and choices, and people need to be faced with the evidence and the difficulties that inevitably will arise as we need to change our behaviour, our consumption behaviour, our patterns of production and consumption. Ireland is not going to solve the global climate crisis, but we do need to show moral leadership. And what we're discussing here this evening is an example that we're going to see repeated again and again when jobs are lost and communities are impacted.
Mr. Healy, I'm now going to bring in Deputy Marcella Corcoran-Kennedy. You have 10 minutes, Deputy, and I'll just give you a little tap after 3 minutes to let you know your timing.
Thank you very much indeed, Chair, and thank you all for coming in this afternoon, or this evening, I suppose it is, at this hour of the evening, to help us in our deliberations. Can I just ask you, Mr. Joyce, when was your Energy and National Resources Sector Group established? And do you see your role as an influencer with the amount of workers that you represent? Because you do represent, I don't know if it's up to 800 workers when you put all of the numbers, 800,000 when you put them together. Do you see yourselves as being influencers in terms of getting the message around climate action out, as well as obviously dealing with the more practical aspects of the transition in terms of job losses and job creation and all of that? And I suppose it comes to the real nub of it, which is, have you accepted that the climate is changing? And have you accepted the findings of the IPCC report? Just in relation to specifically my own area in the Midlands, I think language around, and I know you probably didn't mean it deliberately, Senator, but dubbing my area as a Rust Belt, I totally reject that kind of language. I think it's disgraceful, and I don't think it's appropriate to use that kind of language in terms of the entrepreneurs and the really hard-working people that live in the Midlands. They deserve better than that kind of language. The Midlands Action Plan for Jobs had a target of 14,000 to be created up to the end of this year, and it is in excess of 15,500 at this point. So I don't think that we need to be concerned about the fact that there are in fact jobs being created. The key, of course, for ourselves is to make sure that people are upskilled. I appreciate that there are people who are in their 50s who are maybe a lifetime doing a particular job, but they'd be well capable of being upskilled, and I think they deserve the opportunity to do that. And I suppose it's just considering what you see as being a role for the Just Transition community, because, or the Just Transition Forum. It seems that you're saying that it's just on a regional basis. Have you examined whether or not that's sufficient, considering we're a small island? I mean, I noticed that in Australia, the example you gave was about a town that put this plan in advance of the closure of the power station there. Now, it's a continent, so that's fair enough. You'd accept that they'd have to have regional for there. But I'm just wondering, because we're a small country, should we actually have a national transition forum? And have you examined whether the National Dialogue on Climate Action would fulfil that role? or whether the regional action plan for jobs implementation committees would fulfil that role, or is there a role for them? I would appreciate you teasing that out. Who would you see leading the Just Transition Forum that you propose there? Would it be the unions, or would it be, as I say, those? Because I know in other countries it's the unions that are actually leading it. In terms of the retrofitting that we know is required, I would have thought there's a great opportunity there for new work. We know that there's going to be a significant amount of work done, particularly in all the public buildings, local authority houses, all of that. And there are no doubt skills shortages already in that field. I mean, we hear from the Construction Industry Federation that they're bringing in workers from abroad, and I would have thought that there could be people who have practical skills, highly skilled, I might add, people that could be upskilled and that could fulfil that role in terms of being part of that, and it could be a great opportunity for them. The other thing I was wondering is if you've developed any view on the brown to green policy to replace peat with biomass energy, if that's something that you see other opportunities there for workers. And also the National Mitigation Plan, which was produced last year, I was wondering if you engaged in the public consultation on that, because clearly there's going to be huge impact on people across other sectors as well as just the energy generation and production sector, in terms of the decarbonisation of everything, as well as electricity, both the built environment, all of that kind of thing. And I was just wondering if you had consulted in that, because, as I say, you represent a huge amount of workers, and I see you as a very key influencer in all of this.
Mr. Joyce, I'll bring you in first there on those.
Okay. There's a lot in that, so I'll take a couple of them and maybe hand over to colleagues as well then. Maybe to take the easier ones first. Have we accepted the science? We didn't even put the science in our opening statement, because I think we're gone beyond a discussion about whether this is happening or not. I mean, the science is so I won't spend any more time on that. In terms of some kind of structure, I mean, we've used the word forum, but I've seen Just Transition Commission and different words used. You're correct. I mean, the Midlands is where this is, where the light is shining at the moment in terms of this, but this is clearly a national question. Certainly, we would have no objection to a national Just Transition Commission. It wouldn't be led as such by us, but we would be participants in it. I mean, I suppose that one of the key points in our opening statement is that this is about involving the relevant stakeholders in a commission, which frankly should be led by government. It's government that are responsible for getting...
Whether you saw the National Climate Dialogue, the national... In relation if that would be it, or the other ones?
No, the National Dialogue for Climate Action, if I'm giving it the correct term, is an outreach, if you like, to communities to discuss the issues of climate change and what people are doing, what people can do, sharing information. It's not a forum for negotiating a way forward. So while it has its merits and we have no difficulty with it, it's not the kind of social dialogue, if you like, that we're talking about in this particular instance. Okay. Does anybody else want to...
Just very quickly on the role of the committee, or the sectoral group. It was established some years ago, but it was reactivated of late. We have two specific projects at the moment. One of them is a shorter kind of interim report around the situation in Bord na Móna and how we might achieve a just transition there and what measures would need to be put in place. We expect to publish that fairly soon. And then a longer term, which would look at the just transition on a national basis. So that we would hope in the new year. And learning from the example, as we said, of Australia and more recently of Spain, where they achieved a just transition after 4 or 5 years of disputes and arguments and rows and so on. That deal was only announced in October in relation to their coal mining sector. So the examples are there, and there's plenty there to learn from. We don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Alan, did you want to come in?
Yes, just on a number of points. You've asked how did we engage on the mitigation plan. Yes, both ICTU and indeed SIPTU wholeheartedly engaged in that process, and you will see if you look at the website our submissions in that regard. And in terms of national dialogue on climate action, in terms of regional meetings, our shop stewards at local level and workers from these industries and other industries, because let's be very clear, climate action is for all workers, are engaging in that process. In fact, if you look at the Citizens' Assembly, you see that SIPTU submitted almost a 15-page submission to the Citizens' Assembly, and in fact was shortlisted for Citizens' Assembly members to discuss. In terms of the unions, it was the union movement at the international level who put the just transition into the Paris Agreement, and in fact it's the unions who have pushed very hard at COP24 this week and prior to that to have a just transition statement. And within that, if you look at that very clearly, what is the declaration means for workers this week and the unions that they've a seat at the negotiation table, because that's really important, because what you don't have at the present moment is social dialogue around these issues. And Senator Devine asked earlier on about looking at the Midlands. We asked for the last 2 years for the under Minister Naughton and now Minister Bruton, their department, to do a piece of research on the impact on the Midlands. That hasn't happened. In fact, when the department was here at this committee 6 weeks ago, they stated very clearly that that will be ready in January, but when parliamentary questions were asked in the last month, they have said, well, we haven't even agreed the terms of reference for that. And in fact, we've been campaigning and asking for that for the last 2 years, but the department has not been forthcoming in doing that piece of research, and that would have been very important for people in the Midlands, whether they work in Bordemona, ESB or wherever. It's very important to have that piece of research. We've alluded to a few examples in terms of the just transition, but just to go to a country, I suppose, that's as small as we are, and in Ireland as well. In New Zealand, the government has developed a just transition and economic diversification plan based on social dialogue with unions and broad stakeholder consultation. And this is a plan for them going forward. And if you look also in terms of Scotland recently, they have already established recently in September, actually, the government established a National Just Transition Commission with unions and stakeholders. So I think that's really important, is that the declaration coming out this week in terms of the Poland conference is to base this just transition on social dialogue, and that's what is needed from government.
That's great. Okay. Do you mind just briefly rephrasing them then so we can get them answered?
Yeah,
Sorry,
I was just wondering about the upskilling, for example. It sort of relates to what you were saying about the survey of staff and all of that. In terms of across, like, would you see that as your role to see what staff skills are within the companies that are being impacted, or would you see that as the role of the company itself?
Well, I wouldn't see it as solely our role. I mean, clearly we would have a role in that discussion, but it would be like in Bordemona's case, for example, it would be their responsibility, as Willie has already said, to have that information.
And I asked the question about whether the action plan for jobs regional implementation committees were anything that you'd examined in terms of trying to advance.
Yeah, I'm not overly familiar with the structure of those, but if unions and employers and everyone are around the table, I mean, I don't see why they couldn't be involved in it. But I don't know if colleagues are familiar with those structures or not.
I mentioned the brown to green policy of Bordemona in terms of replacing peat with biomass.
If I may, there is talk about replacing peat with biomass. But again, I'm new to the energy sector, but for the short time I'm in it, my understanding is that they will burn half of Sweden trying to keep the power stations going if they're running them on biomass. That's a bit of a red herring. They can't get enough ships to ship in the timber quick enough to put them into the power stations. So a lot of the information going out about biomass, I think people need to read up on it and educate themselves regarding what's...
Well, my question is, have you done that, though? I would have thought that Congress would be really important, that it would be something that you would be familiar with.
And we are, and that's why I'm explaining to you, we are familiar with it.
Yeah,
to put out that biomass is going to replace peat, that's a complete red herring. So it's as simple as that. It's a complete red herring. In relation to biomass as well, there are anomalies in the state at the moment. I've highlighted at a number of forums where there's waste product going into plants in the Republic at the moment. They're being transformed into wood chip, and they're being lorried in lorries, burning an awful lot of diesel up to power stations up in Derry, for example, and they're burned in the power stations up there. But yet that same product can't be brought down to Heydon Derry and burned down there because the EPA would object because it's a waste product. If that same product was brought up to the north and shipped,
But that's biomass.
Sorry?
That's biomass.
I know that, but if that was brought up and shipped in the north, it can then be brought back down here. So there is anomalies in the legislation at the moment, which is, you know, it doesn't make sense. That's in regard to the biomass. But in relation to a point that you did raise, Deputy, and that was regarding a just transition. A just transition in all its formats is that it should be just, it should be fair. Now, at the moment, the shareholder has put out a redundancy package, which I believe you yourself were on the media stating that it was great to get this package out there. What that actually means in reality is that people in middle management and supervisory staff, that's say in circa 40-50,000 on a salary, they're able to get double, up to 2 years' salary plus statutory in a redundancy package. Whereas the people on the ground who are on basic pay of 350 to 400 to 450 a week cannot do so. That's not fair, that's not just. So that's the reality, that it's grand talking about a pan-national just transition. And you've raised the question about whether it should be done on a national basis or on a regional basis. I'm a Roscommon man. There's people beside me who, their generations, have worked in Mount Dillon. They don't come under the Midlands, because Roscommon's not in the Midlands. So to have something done on a regional basis and to exclude them is not a just transition. There are real people working in real jobs for generations. So somebody has to look at this and say, well, what is fair to the people in the Midlands? Is it fair to come up with a plan that's going to help people up in Donegal or people in Tralee who are not affected by Bord na Móna closing? Or is it now reality that there's people losing real jobs at this moment in time, and can we come up with something specifically tailored for the Midlands that's going to come into effect over the next 3 or 4 years? If not, well, there's no point in trying to call the people in the Midlands to say we're going to do something for the people in Bord na Móna, because in reality we're not. We're just having a talking shop about it. The reality of it is I'm facing hundreds of workers on a daily basis who are saying what is going to be for me in 3 to 4 years' time. I haven't got the answers. Now I'm looking at people like yourself who are in those constituencies to get down and meet those people and to come up with real plans and to tell these people who are 61 or 62 years of age that you are going to get the very same as if you were working in a corner shop down the road there. You're not going to get 1 cent extra in your redundancy package. And as for something specifically in this area, there's nothing there. That's not just transition. What we're looking for is something that can be tailored and it can be done. Now, who leads that? We're not hung up from the two perspectives to know who leads it, as long as it's done. And we don't really care what badge you're wearing from a political party once it's done, because those workers don't care who really delivers, as long as it's done. And that's the only comment I'd make.
Yeah, just to come in.
Very briefly.
Yeah, thank you very much. Just in relation to recommendation 3 of the Citizens' Assembly report on climate action, they actually recommended that the carbon tax be increased, and I was wondering if you had taken a position on that, because as you know it was introduced in 2010, and whether it's something that you have a view on.
Let our economist answer that one.
Well, I mean, the questions we're asking are valid because we have to produce a report. I'm not giving a view. I'm just asking questions. So I think it's important that we know where you're coming from.
I can't speak for Congress on carbon taxation because I don't think the trade union movement has taken a position on carbon taxes. But I can say to you that yes, I think we should increase carbon taxes, but I think we should do it in a very careful way, in a way that doesn't damage low-income households, and that takes cognizance of the fact that in many cases rural communities, for example, it's not an option to switch to alternatives to diesel or solid fuel heating, for example, in rural homes. So I think it's something that needs to be seen as part of a strategic investment plan. I think the role of carbon taxes is twofold. One is to raise money for investment in renewables and in green energy. The other is to help people to change their behaviour. But you can't help people to change their behaviour if there aren't other options in terms of, for example, heating or indeed transport. So I think it needs to be a joined-up effort. To that extent, there are good examples in other countries of where carbon taxes can be ring-fenced, and part of the benefits of a fund can be paid back to households by way of a dividend, for example, which could be used for better insulation and retrofitting. Now, there is a connection here, I think, to what we were just talking about a moment ago in the Midlands, because a very high proportion of the housing stock, particularly in the Midlands, would be of low insulation standard. So there, I think, is a challenge to bring a significant proportion of the housing stock up to A or B rating, B or rating. And that requires a certain mix of skills. It probably involves a whole new range of enterprise activity, but it also means that households could benefit through a system of dividends paid back from a transition fund, which is partly funded from carbon taxes. But I do emphasise that the lessons of other countries, including France, for example, of how not to do this and how to create such a strong public reaction that sees this as an attack on people's living standards and even with regional implications as well. So I do think it's important to get that balance right. I think the key point alongside carbon taxes, and even more important than carbon taxes, is the point that the state should lead investment through an entrepreneurial effort, particularly ESB and Bord na Móna, have the opportunity now, I think, to launch new activities through the development of, for example, solar and wind power. We don't realise actually how much access we have to solar power in this country. I know this might seem surprising, but actually particularly the east and the southeast do have the possibility of developing new energies, and these can be done across the bogs in terms of giant solar panels. And there are examples as well in the area of wind power from Denmark, where community cooperatives are linked into the electricity grid, and they have made a transition over 3 decades and have weaned themselves off much of their dependence on fossil fuel imported energy to wind power. But the key thing, I understand, in Denmark is that communities were given a stake in these community cooperatives. And that, I think, is a crucial point, because in places like Offaly and Roscommon and Longford, for example, understandably, in some cases, there's a strong reaction against some new forms of activity, including wind turbines. Well, one way, I think, to get people into owning the problem is to actually give them a stake, an ownership stake, and that may also be a possibility for workers who are made redundant. Perhaps there are possibilities of worker cooperatives actually developing new services and activities.
Sorry for cutting into your time.
Sorry, there was just a remark addressed to myself by Mr. Noon, and I just wanted to comment on it and to reassure Mr. Noon that I'm very much engaged with the workers on the ground, and it is as a result of the workers contacting me directly and asking me for this information that I sought it and received it, and that was the only reason that I had it. Just to clarify that. And I'd be happy to meet you anytime either. I haven't heard from you in a long time.
Thank you. Deputy John Lahart, you have 10 minutes, and I indicate after 3 minutes just to know what you're doing. Thank you.
Okay, so if we can focus at the task in hand. I want to thank Victor for the presentation, and look, I think one of the obvious weaknesses of the Citizens' Assembly, it was always going to be a weakness of the Citizens' Assembly, is dealing with the politics of climate change. And so, you know, they very clearly stated what they stated, and then it's up to this committee to deal with the reality on the ground. So you're really the first witnesses that have come before the committee to outline exactly what that involves, and I want to thank Mr. Noon in particular for outlining what the reality is for people, many of whom may have spent a lifetime working for a company with a particular skill set, and on the one hand, because of the age cohort of some of them, they simply won't be working again after this. The mean age, as you say, is 56, so the mean average remaining working life for that group in the country, in the company, is about 12 years. I'm 54, and I hope the next 12 years are among the most productive in my life. But I think there's one word in your opening statement, and it talks about the impact. And it's a small enough word, easy to overlook. I don't like the approach that says, sure, they can upskill, sure, they can train. It's not as easy as that. And I think the word impact actually captures the necessity of that. If you're working in a company for 30 years, and it's all you know, and I think that is what Senator Devine was talking about. You know, in the States, people relied utterly on particular industries, and then almost overnight they disappeared, hence the word Rust Belt. It's not a criticism, and it's not assigning a particular label to a particular part of this country. It's borrowing, I think, from the experiences in another country where communities were left devastated. And I think that point has to be made. So it's too easy for us to say they can upskill, sure, can't they do that, this, can't they do that. I think we have to accept, and I'm focusing on that word impact, the human element of what's going on and what's facing people. And that involves a whole range of things. It's very frightening for some people. It can be a huge opportunity for others, but it's very frightening for some people. That's why I welcome your contributions today, who've spent a lifetime. The idea in one job, the idea that they could just easily transit into another, is full of fear and full of intimidation for them. And this is the piece, I think, that this transition forum idea, and it's my introduction to it today, so thank you for bringing it to us. I think that's the piece, a big part of that piece. That preparation has to be put in. People have multiple needs aside from, income and work. There's a whole confidence issue. Some people just don't have the confidence and have to be mentored along to actually move from one particular phase of employment life into another, and that's a particularly challenging piece. So that's not lost on me, is what I'm saying. I don't want to labour it. Mr. Healy was particularly provocative and thought-provoking in that sense. We visited in the sense of the opportunities that may lie ahead. And obviously, look, ICTU have to be persuaders here. We were in Tipperary, the Climate Action Committee, some of us last week, where, Ted, the Clerk of the Committee, said where we saw a lot of the things that we've been talking about in theory, we were kind of grounded by a number of the things that are going on down there under Tipperary Energy Agency. We also heard about communities, because it was interesting what Mr. Noon said about wind energy, and that, look, there's been a loss of appetite around that, and it's controversial. And one of the groups we met were saying one of the contributory reasons for that is that communities were promised a direct community benefit in wind energy. They were promised that there would be local community fora, that there would be local community buy-in, and that there would be a community dividend when wind energy came to their town. But what has happened, of course, is that hasn't transpired. It's the corporates who've had the dividend. So we need to go back and look at wind energy. If it is true that solar panels could be laid right across the bog with all the economic and employment benefits that derive from that, that simply can't happen without the community having ownership of it. And it could be ownership in terms of having some energy dividend personally, or being involved in the construction, and in other words that involves training, etc. We can't have a situation where a multinational company comes in, or a big corporate company comes in and kind of takes ownership of the bog and does what it wants with it in terms of solar energy or other energy alternatives. It must come from the community up, because if there's one lesson we learned from last week, it was this. Communities lost interest in wind energy because there were made promises that actually never came through, that would have had a direct benefit from them. So I'd like your feedback on that. There is one critical thing, look, I want to say, because you're talking about ESB and coal, and I think it was referenced from Ray last week as well about that, that book, Who Moved My Cheese? No one can say, and it's the only criticism I make of you, Willie, is this, that is, the timeline has been brought back from 2030 to 2025. That could be, and I'm not a minister, so I'm talking as a layman, as a citizen, that could be brought back to 2020. I mean, you must have seen this coming. This is what, and you must see this coming in the other industries. And you must really persuade and act as persuaders and informers, even to sit down with companies and say, look, this is coming. You're telling us it's not coming, but it's as obvious that this is coming and it's going to happen, and not to be surprised when it happens. Because you can see from David Attenborough's contribution in Poland during the week, it's actually getting more urgent. So timelines that may have been put out, because we've been appallingly poor in this country at addressing climate change, are probably going to have to be pulled back in.
2.5 minutes left for the panel answer. So
okay, so there are a couple of points. But one of the things, Tom Healy, you mentioned there may be more employment opportunities. You've mentioned one or two of them. You might develop it. One of you mentioned as well about Bord na Móna having some good ideas regarding alternative employment. You might kind of flesh that out a little bit as well. But just to finish, and I won't come back in again, Chair, there's a golden opportunity here. I think there are some age groups 60 over, it may be particularly challenging.
Hold on. Like the previous speaker went on for...
but just... Can I just finish this point? I think there's a golden opportunity here in terms of retraining, in terms of apprenticeships. We learnt that in Tipperary, in terms of all the wind or the energy-related retrofitting, all of that. But it has to be handled sensitively, and I think the forum for that is your just transition. Thanks, Chair.
If you could just be brief with the answers, because there is a lot of people wanting to get in. So,
I'll be very brief. Deputy, I agree with practically everything you have actually stated, except, of course, the piece where you criticised me. That you said I shouldn't be surprised. We weren't surprised. When I say we weren't, the workers in Bord na Móna weren't surprised at all that they're going to get out of peace, and they weren't surprised at all either that the time frame for that has been brought forward, because they could literally feel it in the wind what was happening over the last number of years. What they are surprised about, though, is that there has been a lot of talk by politicians, by the trade unions, by all commentators on it, be ex-presidents or citizens' assembly, etc., that the people involved should be treated fairly. What has surprised them, and this is the third time I'm saying it at this meeting, what has surprised them is that there's people actually being told now their jobs are gone, and they are not getting 1 red cent extra. There's people out there who are in their 60s. They're told their jobs are gone, and they're told that the package that's being offered to them is inferior than what's been offered to other semi-state workers in the recent past. Inferior, who are not going through a decarbonisation policy, who are not going through any sort of are not being affected by the decarbonisation policy and should come under the umbrella of a just transition. So they are surprised that there's people out there who should be putting their shoulders to the wheel to ensure they're treated fairly. They're not looking for anything over and above what they think is their entitlements. And I think it's very unfair that there's people out there who are well capable of getting jobs, who have good skill sets, particularly in senior management and middle management, who are actually going to get a golden handshake and walk out the door and probably walk into jobs fairly shortly. Whereas there's people, as you mentioned yourself, who are in the age profile who can't do that, and they're being treated unfairly. The other thing I just want to briefly comment on is, and you mentioned a dividend for the wind farms. I totally agree that if there's wind farms coming in and being suggested to someplace, there has to be a direct connect to the communities, that they can get dividend from that. You also mentioned solar panels. And one of the suggestions I've actually floated, I don't know whether it will take traction or not, but there's government policy at the moment, for example, to give a 40% grant for people to put solar panels on their houses. I'm saying, why not look at that? Increase that grant and specifically target at the Midlands. So that means you can put in local authority houses, put in all other houses that's in Banagher and Burr and Tullamore and Mullingares, and it means that will actually attract work to the Midlands. It'll benefit the people in the Midlands, and it should be easily doable if the political will is there. There's a mountain of ideas. If they talk to people in the Midlands, what could come about, which is all energy related, it's directly targeted at the Midlands, etc. And you mentioned solar panels. Solar panels is the answer, I think, on government buildings, on private houses. There's an answer there in that itself, and I'll leave it at that.
Thanks. The next speaker is Senator O'Sullivan. You have 10 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And thank you for your presentations. I just want to acknowledge some of the work that I see you have been doing, because I think it's important to take stock of the measures you've taken already today. SIP2 have prepared a research booklet for members and commissioned Mary Robinson to write in Liberty to educate their members on actions that they can take. And this was mainly the work I know, Yvonne, you were involved in, and Adrian Kane, who are involved on the climate change dialogue. So I want to acknowledge that and the work of Impact under the leadership of Joe O'Connor and Kevin Callan commissioned an IEA and Just Transition report on the implications of climate for the workforce. So it's not that you're not doing anything, and I think it's important to acknowledge that. Nick, too, you've set up your Energy and Natural Resources Committee, and you had a conference on this issue. So my question to you is, do you feel supported by government with regard to just transition? Do you think your members feel supported? Because, I mean, it's not like climate change has come about in the last few days or weeks. We're talking about climate change now for nearly 30 years, where we started to acknowledge it. So, and I mean, given what David Attenborough said yesterday, like, the threat facing humanity and all species on Earth is looming near. He said it's on the horizon. So my question is specifically, do you feel supported by government at this time? Do you think your workers feel supported? Do your communities feel supported?
Well, I think you've heard from Willie in terms of how the Board Namona workers feel. Thanks for the acknowledgement of some of the work. We have been, if you like, beavering away to try and promote this concept of a just transition with limited success, I would say. There are references to just transition in the National Mitigation Plan, etc. You know, it's in the sort of common parlance in terms of discussing climate change now, etc. But, and I think as Willie has outlined, I mean, in terms of actually things happening, very little has happened in relation to a just transition. I mean, we all know, and you know, we've all acknowledged that change has been coming for some time. It's becoming more and more urgent. We saw, you know, the science keeps, you know, getting worse and worse in terms of what we need to do. So no, we don't feel particularly supported. We hope that as a result of our work and as a result of our discussions with you this evening, and we really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk and the level of engagement that we're experiencing, and we hope that in terms of recommendations emerging from this committee, that we can finally start to put some, if you like, meat on the bones of what a just transition would look like here in Ireland, you know.
And can you, like, what to your mind would that be?
Well, I mean, we're open to proposals. It's not that we're arriving here with all of the answers to everything. I know that your own party has just published a bill, a just transition bill, which we are very interested in, and we look forward to further engagement in terms of what that might look like. But I mean, I suppose the kind of the main message and some of the discussions we're having here are the kinds of discussions that need to take place in decision making and we need to be around the table and workers and their representatives, so that, you know, we can be part of the change that's going to happen rather than just be objects of it, you know.
And Yvonne, you talked about social dialogue. How are you engaging the workers? Well, I suppose at ground level, in order to prepare, not to prepare it, because as you said, Willie, you know, the transition now for the Board Namona workers, like it was put out to whatever 28, now it's brought back. Like we know we're looking at the level, you know, of carbon in the atmosphere, the global warming, the speeding up. Like how are you going to work with your workforces to prepare them for this change? Because there's a psychological thing that's going to happen as well as the skill, the, you know, upskilling or reskilling or whatever. So, Yvonne, that one specifically.
Yeah, I suppose a number of things. I alluded to earlier on, like we work with the International Trade Union Confederation and the ILO around these issues. As you know, the Irish government is a member of the governing body of the ILO at this present moment, and the ILO, in terms of the International Labour Organisation, has a very strong position on the just transition and has put out, not only through its workers group within the ILO, very strong guidance on what the just transition looks like in a practical sense. Because what we've been trying to do over the last number of years, and I allude to some of the work that we've been doing, is to get our members to understand the concept of both climate change and what's happening and how they fit into that, in terms of not to be afraid of it, but that a just transition is the answer to moving all of our workers, not just in the peat industry or transport, which are the immediate ones, but all of our workers, whether public or private sector workers, into that low carbon economy. And in fact, at the international level, trade movement to set up a Just Transition Centre, which is looking at best practice and how we engage with workers, but also how governments are putting forward such things as the Just Transition forums across different countries to deal with these issues. And some of the examples I alluded to earlier on is because those examples are not specific to an industry. What they're looking at is how do we move our whole country into a low carbon economy and move all our workers, starting with the ones who are in the high carbon industries and moving onwards. So for example, some forums are looking at how do we counterbalance this by investing in low carbon industries such as care work, where you have a lot of women working, or in the arts or in education, and how do we invest our money into that, because those sectors are growing, and so that's important as well. So it's an all-encompassing approach, and I think that's really important. And yes, through our energy sector committees and other committees that deal with the ones that are going to be impacted first, we are discussing, we have in any union shop stewards, we have committees set up, and we are engaging with them on a constant basis. But what's missing really is that social dialogue, decision-making forum in which we move from the concept and just having the just transition on paper and moving into the practicalities of how do we do that and how do we discuss around a table and make a decision how we move forward. Because right now we don't have that, and I think that's important, that there has to be some leadership from government in that regard.
Sorry. And you said there was a Just Transition Centre. Is that established? Or?
Yes, the International Trade Movement has a Just Transition Centre which filters through all the best practice in terms of how trade unions are engaging with workers at local level and national level. I know David alluded to what happened in Australia and in Spain, and all those are filtered through there so that we all know what's going on through that centre. So it's a newly established thing over the last number of years, but it's an important one.
No, that sounds really good. And then, given the scale of this, the climate crisis and that, one thing that we've discussed at length here is the importance of that kind of everyone has to engage, all departments, all sectors, all unions, whatever. Are you actually collaborating with government departments or discussing, or in order to have some kind of, that we're all moving together on this?
Sorry,
and again, I suppose that goes on, is the government supporting you or not, you know?
Just, there's 1 minute left in this, so just to keep the answer as brief as possible.
Yeah. No, thank you, Deputy. You referenced the conference that was held back, organised by the group back, and it was May 2017. And in that, there were some specific proposals which I think go some way to addressing some of your questions. And so this was the establishment of a tri-party body comprising the trade unions, employers and the government to ensure the transition. Okay, so that was one type of body to that action at a central level. There was also the question of establishing the Just Transition Fund, which is happening at the European level as well, but then what does that mean at national level as well? And importantly then, the study of the impact of meeting our goals in the Paris Agreement will have on the whole communities and the industry, and then the legislation backing that up in terms of the principles of the just transition. And the committee has been liaising with the department in terms of research, in terms of trying to put, as was referenced earlier, in doing those research studies, but it hasn't advanced really. That's part of the problem. It's a big problem. We all recognise that, and there's a huge impact. And it's in terms of the sort of things we need to roll out. They're not going to happen in a peaceful way. It does need a programmed approach to this. This is like a rural electrification of the past. You have to be led by the state, very much on state entities. That's the fundamental point.
Thanks, Senator. Just to say that, when we get to 4 minutes, I'll just make a little bit of noise, okay? Just to be fair to the speakers and the people trying to reply. Deputy Munster isn't here. If I take that, I'll take that slot. Just have a couple of very brief questions, and we'll move along to the rest of them. First of all, just thank the delegation for coming in from the trade union. And as a former employee of Bordnamona, I have particular interest in this. What happens, and particularly in the constituency that I'm in, as well from a constituency point of view. Just a couple of very brief questions. Just in terms of the transition, and obviously, we've been highlighting this. Realistically, there's an opportunity there in terms of changing, from what we termed, the brown revolution to a sustainable revolution, in terms of, new industries. And just in terms of, I suppose the concern from the workers, a lot of them that I speak to is that there won't be the same number of jobs. And Willie maybe is best placed to, from a point of view of being on the ground, to give a view on this. What is the best way of, in terms of, trying to find an alternative that would provide substantial employment? Because the board are looking at a number of options, around energy, horticulture and aquaculture. But we all know, particularly those of us that have been employees of it, that won't create the same level of work that there was in peat extraction, be it in horticulture or be it in the fuel. And I think that's a huge concern. I'm just wondering, has the ICTU looked at other industries? Like the board have come up with their 3 big ones as they see it, and have outlined those. But from the ICTU point of view, are there other ones that you've looked at? Because all of us desperately want to see employment. I think means very, very important that's maintained. You're talking about communities where there was very little up to the 1950s, and older people who remember it before then would tell you that, how difficult it was in those areas. We're now facing back, kind of post-Bordnamona period, or post-peat extraction, that we don't go back to that. And, just wondering about that. And the only other question, that's one question. Second question is just around the Climate Action Fund. The Climate Action Fund is there. There was 77 million announced the other day out of it, all for very good projects, and to be welcomed. But the Midlands and Bordnamona did not figure in that. And if it's a Climate Action Fund, do you feel that some of that money should have gone towards recalibrating and getting Bordnamona into a different space in terms of moving along with new industries?
Can I just say specifically in relation to the to any proposals, we are working at the moment with the Neville Institute in drawing up a report specifically on the Midlands region and on the response to Bordnamona and how you can try and ensure that there is a just transition. So we will have specific proposals around that in the coming weeks, we would hope.
Okay.
Okay.
That's very well. And the other question?
Yeah, you asked about the same number of jobs. Bordnamona is they have come forward with some plans, and our view is that they've had made some bad decisions in the recent past. But they believe we've been told that they have these robustly audited and checked for the risks in regard to the industries they're going into. So you can only take the bona fides as being correct. And they believe that these jobs, the quantum of jobs will be equal to the numbers of jobs that's being lost. The problem that we have is with the age profile in the company, that these jobs won't come on stream quick enough to aid the people who are currently losing their jobs. But that's also tied into to this redundancy package I keep bringing up, because the redundancy package, the quantum of it is not the issue. in case people might think it is. The issue is the fairness of the way that's been distributed, because what the company are saying to us is that they're going to select people for redundancy on financial criteria. What that means in reality is that they'll select whatever is the most financially advantageous to the company. So they will intend to let people go out with 25 years service out of the company and keep people who may be in their 60s. Because as far as they're concerned, it's more financially advantageous to get rid of the person who may be in their 30s or maybe in their 40s. Our view would be that they should exit the person who's in their 60s, who at this stage, is not going to be there to be re-employed into a job that may come on stream in 5 or 6 years' time, because he's gone too old. What they need to be doing is let that person out and reskill and retrain the person who's in their 30s or 40s, who will be able to benefit.
And just in relation, because I'm mindful of the rest of the people in the committee, just in relation to the Climate Action Fund, do you feel that we should be making a pitch for that? Maybe someone from Neville Institute or the ICTU might answer that. Should there be a strong pitch made for that, to move Boardnamona into a different space?
Yes, I think there's an opportunity to bring together expertise and funds to coordinate and lead. I think the challenge here is that the state needs to step up to play a role of coordination and leadership, even though many other actors are involved. And I think we need to realise as well that a blueprint is not possible, but a broad plan is. And what I mean by that is that we don't know what ways technology is going to evolve. Even in the last 5 years, the technology for solar power has been transformed. The costs have come down. So it's a different situation now, even just to when we went into recession. So this is where we need imaginative and creative thinking, and it could come perhaps from some of those workers in Newbridge who are in an administrative or a support role. I don't know the details. Willie may know more, but why are we laying off workers, or why are we not considering creating new lines of activity and new possibilities? But in the main, I think new enterprises, particularly in the Midlands, will probably come from new areas, some of which we're not even thinking about. But we need to be, in some sense, ahead of the curve. And that's where I think we have a lot to learn, I think, from Denmark and how they made that transition, which I mentioned earlier, in regards to wind generation. And that's where I think, in some ways, the spirit behind Boardnamona in the 1940s, it was a national emergency. Fuel was running out. There was no imports much of coal and oil, and people were put to work, shovel-ready work. And, subsequently, the flourishing of many semi-state enterprises really filled a gap at that time. And that's what we need to think about again. It's a different context, but the challenge is still there. And I think that just waiting for other people to do it for us, whether it's multinationals or science experts, I think there's a need now to develop some of these new lines of activity. And the urgency, I suspect, or I strongly suspect, is not there in public policy. This is a real crisis internationally as well as nationally, and we need to redouble efforts and investment. And that's something I think that needs to be appreciated.
Could I just ask that the proposals from the Neville Institute, that when you have them ready, you might send them copy into the committee? Sure. Thank you. Move on to Senator from Lahart.
Thank you, Lahart Sherlock. I just have a number of questions. A lot of issues have been covered by previous speakers, in particular my colleague, Deputy Corcoran Kennedy. In your presentation to us, you cited the deal struck by the Spanish unions in October 2018 being a just transition deal with the government in respect of the coal miners, and that there would be a fund of 250 million invested into those communities. Perhaps you could tell us where the money has come from and the process to getting there, if that's if there's more than one contributor. The other, I'll just maybe go through a few of them.
Is there a phone on over there? No.
No.
That's right, okay.
I'll put it down here anyway. Next thing is, we had Board Namona here a few weeks ago, and they made their presentation. And I'm just a bit confused listening to you, Mr. Noon, because Board Namona indicated to us that the redundancies were being made on a voluntary basis, and therefore it was for workers who wished to seek to be made redundant, at least at this juncture. So you might just clarify if that is the case or not. I'm also wondering, because I would agree with Mr. Healy, I think this definitely, and everybody I suppose would agree, we have to be innovative, new jobs. I think also when Board Namona were here, they cited, for example, that is there a tyre recycling plant been established, 50 new jobs in the area, and that this is, I suppose, sustainable type of industry that's required. I'm just wondering, has any application been sought, say, has Board Namona made an application under the Climate Action Fund, or has it been suggested to them, or are our ideas forthcoming in relation to what alternatives there can be? Because, you know, we constantly hear, well, you know, we're not hitting targets, we're behind, and yet lots of times, in my view, we're very short on detail as to what the alternatives will be. I think we've all established there's a problem here that has to be addressed, and it's lots of ideas we need now, and especially as we're drawing up a report. You mentioned solar and wind farms as an alternative, and, you know, on bogs and that, but I assume what you're getting at there is that there would be like an operational fund once these are operational, and that fund would be paid for community benefit or community gain. I'm just wondering, is that what you mean? And that would be a funding pool for entrepreneurship and maybe developing alternative sustainable energies in the area. I suppose on a more macro level, this issue, just the last point really. We're talking about just transition here and the particular sector of workers, energy and natural resources sector group. But it strikes me when we're talking about just transition, the people who have the most potential, and I know the main focus has been on Board Namona workers, and if we try and look at how it's going to impact upon them, you don't need a crystal ball, because you just need to come to where I'm from, where Bellacorrick power station closed down and caused a devastation in the community, which is still recovering, and the tower itself came down in 2010 and the jobs were lost before that, and you know, that it's an evidence already what happens in rural communities. And I suppose it's just getting to my point that it seems that the just transition, or the possibility of, or this transition is going to hit hardest people in rural area. I would imagine that for your workers and who you're representing in your national organisations representing workers across the board, the people who are going to have least options here are people in rural areas. And I'm just wondering, to what extent, in terms of feeding into policy, whether it's a Project Ireland 2040, National Development Plan, etc., and now we're going to have regional plans to implement this, to what extent do you look at worker migration? And actually, you know, we're all about sustainability, and the ideal is that we take workers, or that the imbalance is addressed, and that we see more sustainable growth in these rural areas. And do you feed into policy on this? Have you got policy on this? In that context? And I suppose just a question, I stated it, but would you agree that the people who are going to fare worst are our workers in rural Ireland compared to their counterpart represented by your union? If I'm in the fossil fuel industry and I'm working in Dublin, I'm going to have way more options. So they're just a few questions. Thanks.
Just keep the answers brief, because your 5 minutes almost used up.
No, I'll take the Board Namona's specific questions again. You're right, Senator. Board Namona were in here not so long ago, and I'm sure they forgot to tell this committee that when they went off as a stakeholder to get a redundancy package, they never consulted with the trade unions. So we don't know what they actually look for. And secondly, when the government gave them the approval for the package, we don't know what the government gave them the approval for. We're only taking the words for that.
Was it voluntary or not? They said it's a voluntary.
You're right.
It's voluntary, so it's for
You're right,
workers.
Senator.
Okay.
But as you rightly said, It is voluntary. But you tell that to the people who were let go when the briquette factory closed down in Littleton, when there was no jobs within a 50-mile radius. Tell them that it wasn't voluntary. You tell the people in the coal depots who are losing their jobs as we speak that there's no jobs in their facilities, and tell them it's voluntary. And you tell a worker who's 62 years of age that his bog is closing down and there's a job 30 miles away, what is voluntary? And they'll give you an answer. And you're right. It's the people in the rural areas that I'm from, that's suffering. So you can try and cod people by saying, well, this is purely voluntary, you don't have to take it. So these people are in their 60s.
Sorry, Mr. Neville, now in all fairness, that's pretty inflammatory language. I'm not codding anybody. I asked you a straight question and you failed to answer it until I pressed you. I just asked you, was it voluntary or not at this time? I'm for workers and people in rural areas, I would say as much, if not more than yourself. I'm from a rural area myself and I've just cited the implications. I just asked a question right now. It's not imposed on workers at the moment. We know things can change. We know that it's 2027 is the deadline. And that's the question you were asked. So maybe refrain from
Senator,
your inflammatory...
Senator, you asked a question.
Let's talk about solutions here, Mr.
Senator, I'm not being inflammatory at all. You asked the question, is it voluntary? And you're right to say that, strictly speaking, it is voluntary.
Okay,
and
that's all I asked you, Mr. Nolan. I'm not diminishing anything else you said, so don't diminish anything anybody else has said.
I just want to allow the panel to respond. I think that the answer is being given that is voluntary. Sorry, no, just a second. The answer is being given is very clear that it's voluntary. But I think what I'm seeking to explain is that it's voluntary with certain conditions. So I think you've answered that fairly. And the other questions, if they could be answered.
I might just make a comment in relation to, you were saying impact in rural areas like that. I mean, the other sector of it, the electricity sector has been in transition for a long time, actually, with renewables coming in and displacing fossil fuel plants. It's been on for quite a long time, but obviously that's accelerating more and more. And of course, the big obvious plant is Moneypoint and a coal plant. And what is the economic input of Moneypoint to that community down there, and whether it's county council rates or anything else? So that's, and how is that going to be dealt with? And there's a timeline for that, so that's well flagged. So again, what's the plan?
Just because I know Senator Mahler mentioned the words worker migration. I think it's an important point for us to examine. I think why the Just Transition works in a good few areas is because it keeps not only existing jobs or reskills and retrains them, but also looks at how do you reinvest in those areas to plan jobs for future workers, because this is about making sure that there is jobs for future workers and future generations. And if you look at some of the migration figures, I don't have them in front of me, but you see a lot of young people are leaving these areas because they need to go elsewhere for work. And I know there is reinvestment happening in those regions now, but what we need to be doing is that, and as Willie pointed out and others, that these are industries that have generations of workers. And what we want to make sure is that there are new generations of workers coming into them with new skills, with new skills for new type of clean energy. I think that's important, but because I think that's what the Just Transition is, just to say that that's to keep everybody in those areas, and I think that's very important. But I think it's a very important point for us to take into account in terms of the worker migration.
Okay, we're moving on. No,
the application under the Climate Action Fund.
Just very briefly.
Not that we're aware of, but if it's a potential, if there are funds that potentially can be used to progress this, yes, by all means, yeah.
Okay, we're moving on.
Deputy Pringle is
next.
We're aware of the funds.
Sorry, is Deputy Smith is taking your slot?
No, she's not taking my slot.
No.
She's asked for permission to come in before me.
Yes.
And that's all. Now, if that's not granted, she's not taking the slot.
Okay.
So is that?
No, she can take her slot.
No, but Chairman, this is very serious. Like, I've been sitting here since the start of this meeting.
Coming in before him because I have to go back to speak on the abortion debate.
No. She's not taking my slot.
Okay.
No, I'm not taking a slot at all. And in fact, I want to ask two very quick questions.
Is that agreed?
Yeah. If it's agreed by the committee. Is the committee happy with that? Okay. Proceed. Okay. Proceed.
Thank you very much, Tommy. Fair play to me now for doing that.
Be fair to the rest.
Because I have to make bits of myself here tonight. But I want to ask two questions. The first one of the ICTU, and thank you for your presentation, David. It's interesting. I just want to tease out a bit of detail in relation to how what you say on a just transition would relate to the Bord na Móna workers, because you cite three examples, Australia, Spain and Germany, where transition deals for workers were done that kind of form the template, but there's no detail on it. And do you have detail on the deal you have a small bit of detail on the deal in Spain, which is 250 million agreed for a deal with government employers with respect to the coal mining industry. Now, the Spanish coal mining industry, to my knowledge, is absolutely massive, and 250 doesn't sound like a massive figure. But if you could apply that to the sort of thing Willie was talking about, like what sort of redundancy payments will they, the workers who are being transitioning over to other types of work, retain their pay, conditions, pensions, all that. Because I think that sort of detail is what workers in Roscommon or Clare or Dublin or wherever they are will want to know. Am I going to be secure on pay, terms, hours, pension? And if I am going to be made redundant, are you going to look after me properly? And I think if we don't get this right, we're in for a pile of trouble. Unless we bring people with us and treat them fairly, obviously we're in for a pile of trouble because we don't have a lot of time. And then the last question is on carbon tax itself, because several references were made to it, particularly by yourself. Now, I think that what's happened in France with the yellow vest, the gilets jaunes, have really changed the narrative on this. And that this, today even, you're looking at, you know, even Leo Varadkar in the Dáil today was saying, oh no, we have to be careful how we introduce this. This is the first time they've said that, because the impact of the yellow vest protests and the climb back of Macron's government has had a real impact. And I think there's probably a lesson in that for the Board and Mona workers, that if you want to get just transition, you're probably going to have to fight for it rather than expect it to be delivered. But just on the carbon tax, I'd like to ask you, do you not think it's now the time to say that carbon tax has to be delivered as a tax on profits and wealth rather than on ordinary people who are not benefiting or didn't create the climate change problem and are not benefiting from the just transition?
Okay.
Just with reference to the Spanish example, we are looking for detail from the unions of the specific terms of that detail, and we hope to have a speaker over, maybe come over and brief us about it. I know initially the plan in 2012 was to actually just shut everything down immediately under Rajoy's government, and the unions fought that, and they successfully turned it around. And the plan that was announced last month, the numbers involved in Spanish coal mining have diminished significantly in recent years. So it's not huge numbers. It's confined to 3 regions in the north of Spain, Asturias and 2 others. Yeah, no, it's Asturias and Castilla y Leon, I think one other. It's 250 million, but it's 250 million, to answer an earlier question, that is coming entirely from the state, as far as I'm aware, and it's for retraining and for early retirement for those who are of a certain age.
And you don't know anything about the retaining pay and conditions? You're looking for that detail?
We're looking for that detail from the unions.
Thank you very much. Deputy Pringle.
Thanks, Chairman.
That's real quick, Tommy, sorry.
Yes, I think there's a role, it's a fair point. I think that there is a role for corporations to contribute. Now, how that is done, the very nature of a carbon tax is that it is a tax on the consumption of certain products, such as oil and gas. But I think the important thing is that households also have a contribution to make, but it's the way it is done, I think, that is crucial. I think in relation to corporate contributions, this is really a much bigger challenge. It's a European challenge, and that's one of the reasons why I think the European Union has an important role to play here. And it could be that some form of consolidated common tax base, which I know is a controversial point, but I think there's a link here. Some of that could be linked to a European-wide investment programme in decarbonisation. So that could be one channel in which particularly large multinational corporations could make a contribution.
Okay, thanks very much.
Thank Deputy Pringle very much, and look forward to your bill being passed tomorrow.
Deputy Pringle's been very patient. You've been here from the start.
Oh, that's amazing. But I mean, it's still discussion for another day, but I mean, I think the way that this meeting goes on, the people that be here from the start, end up being the last in. It's not all you know.
To this, Deputy, there's a rota here.
I know there's a rota there, but
I
you well stay away for the rota, onto your point of the rota and come into the meeting.
Well, I agree, but I think, you might be near the end of it today, but hopefully next week, you'll move up. In the scheme
we'll see what happens. Okay, so I take it the clock is starting now, rather than so that was the... Listen, I want to thank you for your presentation here today, and a lot of my questions have already been answered by other contributions and that, so there's not much really that I have to bring in with you, but I'd like to thank you for the information about Bord na Móna, because it certainly was presented here to the committee that Bord na Móna was fantastic in doing everything for the workers to make a very just transition in relation to Bord na Móna. So it's useful to hear the other side of that, and I think that should be very important in terms of the deliberations of this committee for the future. In relation to, you had I noticed on your website that you had a conference in May on the just transition, and you outlined 5 things like the tripartite body, unions, employers and government, just transition fund study, Paris Agreement will have on fossil fuel goals, and the just transition fund then as well. I just wondered, in relation to all of those, what response that you've got from government in relation to them, because the Minister did address your conference as well, which is interesting. And really what I want to get at is, in fact, you have had more to say about climate change and just transition than any of the government departments that have come into this committee, and that's a sad reflection on government and how government is responding to this. Now, I'm not saying you had a lot to say, but I'm saying you had more to say than the government had, and and I think there's something that needs to happen in relation to this here, and I think we have to do it beyond the government. And maybe the Dáil, along with yourselves and civil society, could form together and form a body that we could maybe look at doing this, because certainly the government is way behind everything that we're doing, and there doesn't seem to be any will for them to catch up or to come on board. So I just wondering what kind of response you've got, if any, from the government in relation to that. And I would also just say, in relation to Tom was talking there about wind as being the solution. Certainly from my neck of the woods, wind is not the solution, and the idea of the public acceptance is gone. I believe certainly the public acceptance of wind is gone, and I don't think any argument will actually bring that back. So we have to look at alternatives in relation to that, and I think that's something that maybe you should look at as well. What was the other thing? Yeah. So if you could just do that, and then maybe I might have time for someone else as well. Thanks.
Thanks, Deputy. In relation to a tripartite body. As a result of that conference you mentioned, the Minister did invite us to be part of the National Dialogue on Climate Action. So we took the approach, we'll suck it and see, if you like. And as I said earlier, that has a role, but it's not the kind of forum that we were looking for, and it's a completely different structure. So in that regard, we're still waiting for a response on that one. In terms of a fund, There are, I understand, discussions at a European level in relation to a just transition fund, and whether it will be a separate fund or whether it will be part of a broader adjustment fund. Nationally, I know that climate action fund has been referenced. Perhaps it's a potential source to support some of this kind of work. I don't know. There were 4, weren't there? The
communities looking at the
as I think has been referenced already. A recent parliamentary question revealed to us that the terms of reference for that study haven't even been agreed. So that's a source of much disappointment.
But that's why I'm getting at the point that we have to work beyond the government. And I think really the Oireachtas and yourselves maybe and civil society can actually do this. I would be a bit worried about some of your contributions when you say that everything's over to the government to actually respond, which it is to a certain extent, but it's gone beyond that at this stage, and the government response isn't going to happen. And so maybe we have to force them to respond, and by doing that, is how we do that is what's important. And I think that's where you have to come on board as well.
I take that point, and I know that tomorrow there's a mass lobby taking place of yourselves and colleagues from the Stop Climate Chaos people, who include as part of their agenda, a just transition. And we have not just engaged with government and employers, but also with environmental and other civil society groups in this area as well. So we're really happy that they've taken on that idea as well.
Do you want another brief question?
Yeah, just in relation to the wind energy and stuff like that, just to say that, I think that's gone, and just be careful in relation to that.
Deputy Sherlock.
Thank you, Chairman, and I just want to thank the speakers for coming before us today. I just want to extrapolate a little bit out of the Bord-na-Móna scenario, because for us I think that was going to be the potential exemplar for the just transition. That was going to be the example that we could all refer to as the big glorious project where the workers transitioned and were treated fairly. But I think what we're clearly hearing today here is the sense, or we're getting a very strong sense, that the workers are not getting packages that are commensurate with their years of service, and I think that's something that we have to take very seriously in this committee, because when Bord-na-Móna were before us, they spoke about the 11 town hall meetings that they had. And I'm hopeful that there wasn't a kind of a gloss put on that or a spin put on that. They spoke about, those 11 town hall meetings. They spoke about renewable energy projects at a number of wind farms. They spoke about the anaerobic digestion or aerobic digestion facilities. They spoke about aquaculture, afforestation of 20 to 30,000 acres to develop the biomass biochain. Okay, Willie has expressed some views on that. They spoke about recycling and tourism. So my simple question is, in terms of the engagement, the town hall engagement with workers, do workers have a legitimate expectation within Bord-na-Móna at present, those who hope not to subscribe to the voluntary redundancy, if you will, that they will transition to other areas within the company? So from Congress or SIPTU or any other trade union's perspective, is there an expectation amongst workers now that I, a worker, will be redeployed into one of these areas of activity, and I have a legitimate expectation of of retaining my job, if you will, and my employment?
To answer that as simply as I can, Deputy, the 11 town hall meetings that you're talking about, they were generated by the company, and they took place following the announcement of the redundancy package. So they came back with a fait accompli. In relation to the package itself, and this is the kernel of it, it's the makeup of the package, and it's the selection process, because there's a number of people. The age profile is very high, as I stated earlier. So I've absolutely no doubt that there will be sufficient, and I'm hoping that there will be sufficient people, because if there's sufficient people putting their hands up to take the package, it means that it's easier to exit people, etc. But it's the fairness of that package that is causing an awful lot of disgruntlement with people, because we believe that it's going to be oversubscribed, and what will happen then is the company will select the people who are going to leave, and that's going to be done unfairly, because there will be people told, well, I know for a fact there will be people there with 42, 43 year service who expect that they'll be allowed now to retire, and they're going to be told, no, you're not going. You're going to have to stay here now until you're 65. There's people in their late 50s who are told, can I go now and get my pension? I always was allowed to get my pension up to now, and they're going to be told you can go, but you're not getting any pension. That's actually a change in what was in place 3 months ago. If they went 3 months ago, before the package, they could have left and got their pension. Now they're being told, you can't get your pension. This is crazy stuff.
Sorry, are you saying to us that the goalposts are shifting on a constant basis by management?
Correct.
Okay.
Now, and what we're saying is, we need to have a conversation with the company prior to going into the department looking for sanction for this package, because we knew the age profile, we knew the expectation of the workers, but we were only consulted after the fact. We had given our views, but the consultation, it was only consultation, and we believe our views weren't taken on board. At our last meeting with the company, we clearly told them we don't believe that the stakeholder understood the packages of people now to staff, because I don't believe any politician who's anyway fair-minded at all would allow the package to go out the way it's gone out, and that's the issue. The expectation of workers are the expectation of workers is that they believe that they should get out, but we believe that there's a lot of people going to be disappointed. That the company are clearly saying that they have the last decision-making they're going to make the decision on who's going to get out and who's not going to get out. We've indicated as the company, we believe that maybe 75 to 80% of the people who want to go and should be let go will probably sing off the same hymn sheet in that regard. But there'll be about 20% of people who we believe should get out, that the company are going to say, no, we're going to let out a different 20% of people. And we believe that's going to cause huge problems. Okay. We also believe, and as has already been said about taking it outside of the government, at this moment in time, we may have to go to the streets on this. And we may have to have public protests on this, because I don't believe it's fair that people in Bournemouth and a semi-state company who are in their 60s are told that your job is gone, albeit in theory it's voluntary. In reality, their jobs are gone, and they're going to be told there's no other choice.
So the 6 activities that I've outlined here, which were articulated to us, for instance, there isn't an understanding from your perspective that workers will transition into these areas of activity?
No, with the age profile and the time frame of these jobs coming on stream, the reality of it is the majority of workers believe there may be jobs coming on stream, but they won't be actually in those jobs. It'll be a different cohort of people be in those jobs, but not particularly. It may be Bournemouth employees, but it won't be them.
They won't be them. Okay. Just the language of the just transition, I mean, I think it's important for us to acknowledge as a committee that, you know, the recommendation number 7 actually does, and I quote, you know, talk about making proper provision for the protection of the rights of the workers impacted, and that was 97%. That was an overwhelming mandate, and I think now what we've done in terms of the interaction here with you today, which I feel is very useful, is we're now beginning to develop the language of the just transition. We're teasing that out. I think would you agree that the just transition, the language and what it means and how you populate it in terms of funding and the type of structures you set up, that it's very much an iterative process, but that there has to be some formal process and government has to be a key stakeholder in that, because I think it will take pounds, shillings and pence, because if we're talking about the social protection element of the just transition, the state and government will have to fund into that activity. Because if I was to take the Spanish example, you know, as a transition, you know, €250 million, I mean, is a not insignificant amount of money, but we're talking about a serious funding pot that will have to be made available by government for that, if we're talking about decarbonising the economy. Would you agree with that proposition? Is that your understanding of it?
I would agree, Deputy, and part of the funding, it's a pity Senator Mulhern has left the building, because she was trying to make the point that this is purely voluntary. But when you scrape off the surface of what's gone out to the public, yeah. What actually means is, if a person's in a location at the moment, they could actually be moved. They're not going to be facilitated with voluntary severance, but they could be earning $42,000 a year. They're going to get a job, but the company is saying that when they get a job, they're not promising, and they're giving no commitments that they will retain their earnings. So they may be given a job 25 miles away on $15,000 a year less. So if they take the package, it's purely voluntary. But they don't want to go 20 miles away, and they don't want to earn $15,000 a year less. So, you know, this is the reality. And when people scrape the surface, they need to see that detail. If that answers the question, Deputy.
It does, yeah. And
one was indicating there you wanted to come in briefly.
Yeah, Deputy Chair, just I suppose 2 points, because I know you talked about people transitioning into new jobs and new things that come on stream, but as my colleague Mr Noon said, that may be a new cohort of people. So the just transition is also about retaining the terms and conditions that were had, we'll say, for example, in Bournemouth, 2 new employees coming on stream. It's not about creating a new terms and conditions for new employees. I think that's very important as that part of the just transition as well, but also the fact of, yes, you would need social protection issues. You also need, and I think what Deputy Pringle alluded to, is that it's an all-government approach on this one, because you need Department of Education, you need Department of, in terms of skills and education, you need social protection, you need all of those departments to work together. It's not just down to a particular department trying to do this transition, which is why you come back to having a national forum on it, because then you have an all-government approach on it. Otherwise, you're just siloing it into a particular sector and particular group of workers and a particular department, and I think that's very important in this regard.
We have to move on just very briefly.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, if we're talking about the Midlands in particular, as you know, as a very particular geography, and you know, we're talking about, as Tom was talking about earlier, about, you know, the schemes like deep retrofitting, and you talk about the housing stock within the area, that there's a potential there. Like, have you engaged with the company about, you know, that retraining and upskilling potential? Or is that something that has to be kind of elevated beyond the current talks or dialogue that is in existence with the company at the moment on terms and conditions and on voluntary redundancies and so on and so forth? It's how do we as a committee take the language of the just transition and get take a very bespoke example, like for instance, you know, the peat industry and so on, and say, right, how, rather than kind of speaking rhetorically about what we need to do, how do we actually, you know, what kind of action do we need to, what action does that require, if you will? You know, are the agencies coming in? Are you seeing any activity from the agencies in relation to engagement, or any of the academic institutions like at Law and IT, or any of the nearest ones in relation to how you transition workers? Is there any experience of that as we speak? I don't expect you to answer
just keep the answer brief, because
generally speaking,
we've gone way over. Just briefly.
I'll just give the specifics in the Bord na Móna case. I've had engagement with the company, and I've actually engaged with some member of the European Parliament regarding access and some of the Globalisation Fund. However, there has to be a certain quantum of employees involved. At this moment in time, we don't know how many people will be exiting the company and from what locations. Okay. The monies that may become available from that fund are purely towards training and upskilling. There's two different types of Bord na Móna worker that will be involved. There will be the Bord na Móna worker who will stay working in Bord na Móna for the foreseeable future, and they have a certain training requirement. And there's the Bord na Móna worker who will be exiting Bord na Móna, and the training requirement that's required for them. We have discussed, for example, if people exiting Bord na Móna want to take up a course and have to travel to Law and IT, for example, will they be able to be afforded expenses for travel? And we believe that's attainable. We've also discussed in some detail regarding expertise to train up the remaining workforce, but we have to do the skill audit in regards what's there at the moment and what's going to be required into the future, and match that training with that. And that's just been done as we speak in this current round of talks.
So that's live, the skills audit is live?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Deputy Ryan is back with us. You have 5 minutes.
I just realised that there's a vote being called in the Dáil. Could I beg the indulgence of the panel, if they'd be willing to wait for 5 minutes, 10 minutes or so while that vote is taken? I could return and ask the questions now, because in truth, Chairman, you know we're going to have to run out this door in 60 seconds' time, and I would like the opportunity to ask 3 questions.
Well, we're going to be about 15 minutes. I think put the question. Yeah. Put the question, because in fairness, she'll come in at the end of it.
The future of the Labour movement, I believe, is going to be hand in hand with the environmental movement. Green is the new red, and red is the new green. And I would have to say, like Senator Sullivan has said, that commended some of the work that's been done. I would also like to say, David Joyce, thank you for the work you did. We did together in the climate gathering in terms of a series of sessions where we considered this issue over the recent years. And you brought over the head of the International Trades Union Movement, who said that's absolute truth. For clearly, there are no jobs on a dead planet. We have to work together on this. I appreciate your commentary on our Just Transition Commission. Do you agree the main structure that we're looking for is effectively a mediation service, an independent, fully resourced, skilled team who can be brought in and can be used when you designate certain areas as a need of a specific just transition plan, that it's non-mandatory? I don't know, I don't have a long tradition in the negotiation process, but it's not a binding mediation process, but it is a fully state resource-backed, with all the expertise we can marshal, to provide a mediation service between workers and employers, and indeed also communities, in that just transmission process. Do you think that that sort of structure is the right approach in terms of establishing a Just Transition Commission to assist in this process?
In a word,
I'll ask all 3 questions then, if I can at the same time. Then.
Yes.
Secondly, I agree with very much Mr. Dolan has said. The state is going to have to lead a lot of this. We're going to go back to our future in terms of state leadership. I like the electrification of our country. In that, I was very disappointed that Bord na Móna, in its new new strategy, didn't see the opportunity that I see the company must have in the €50 billion project we have to retrofit our buildings, which we need to do in the next 10, 15, 20 years. And in that, I'd see Bord na Móna having a role. Rather than laying off people in Newbridge, I actually think we're going to have to employ hundreds of additional people in Newbridge to set up an apprenticeship for 1,000 carpenters, 1,000 heating engineers, 1,000 plumbers, 1,000 glaziers.
to manage this biggest, best, most important project. So if we can go back to Boardnamona and say, rather than excluding that from your option of menus and just going with the options you've set out, go big in this. Go big in terms of the state showing that we can be brilliant at creating an apprenticeship system that gives the youth of the Midlands a future. Do you agree with such a strategic development in the state? And the last question. In the structure where I believe your engagement in this should be continuation of the record we also have in partnership. The partnership process has served this country well in my mind, and I believe the structure of the organisational governance structure of this would see it centred around the Taoiseach's office, where you would have Martin Fraser and the Secretary-General from the Department of Climate setting up the types of the Jobs Action Plan and the core centre of the state. The unions have a good connection into that Department of Taoiseach level through the partnership process. Does that make sense to you as a governance structure where the centre coordination of this exercise takes place?
The bell is ringing for the vote. We can't hear it here, but time is ticking away, so if somebody can... Whoever's taking it.
Right, Chair, we're going to be very tight.
Yeah, just brief answers.
In a word, the kind of mediation structure you described is something that, yes, we'd be very interested in. I think, and as you talk about marshalling all the expertise that are needed in particular situations, I think that's the kind of model we aspire towards. And you know, we as we said, we welcome the bill that you've published and look forward to exploring it in more detail with you outside of this room. I mean, partnership. Well, partnership doesn't really, social partnership doesn't really exist in the sense that it did, you know, many years ago, and there's lots of different views on that. There is a Labour Employer Economic Forum which discusses issues but doesn't seek to, you know, agree a way forward or anything like that. So, you know, it would just transition. Could it learn from our lessons from social partnership? Sure. I mean, there are aspects of that could be very useful in developing this idea, for sure. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. I want to thank the. Sorry, you have one more question.
And the apprenticeship and all of that. I think. Yeah.
Okay.
Definitely. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to thank the panel, Jim, Yvonne, Willie, David, McDara, and Tom, for coming in and for answering questions and being patient. I think we're finished the business. If there's no other issues to be raised by members, we're finished the business of the meeting. The next meeting of the joint committee, this committee is adjourned. The next meeting is scheduled for tomorrow, the 5th of December at 2 p.m. Thank you very much.